All right, this video is on the interface of Flash. We're going to take a look at an actual animation so that you get a better feeling for what Flash does. Flash is a 2D animation software. It means it takes flat objects and animates them in time. Okay, now the interface that we're looking at here is actually CS6 version, but we are working with CC. Essentially, most of the tools are available. Any of the videos that I share with you guys, you will actually be able to do the same thing. The only thing that might appear a little bit different is by default, the color palette, like this one is a little bit of a lighter gray. CC has a darker gray, but you can change those settings. The palettes will be arranged differently, but essentially they will be the same palettes with the same options available. They'll just be arranged differently, and that stuff you can change, and we'll go over that. Okay, so if things look a little bit different, that's why, but essentially you have the same thing available. All right. So to get started, here we have the stage. This is this white panel. It's the equivalent of, say, your canvas or your paper in Illustrator or Photoshop. And the difference with this is that things on this stage here will actually move. So you got to think of this as like a play. This is where all the characters start to act and do stuff, okay, as your movie runs, okay? So this is basically what your camera or your audience would be watching, okay? Now over here we have this properties palette, okay? And we also have this library palette. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the library palette first. The library palette is kind of like a chest for like puppets, or like a chest that contains props. It's where all of your different parts that you're going to need for your movie are held, okay? And when you need them, you can actually use them on the stage by just dragging instances of them, okay? So these are essentially your characters, okay? They're called symbols in here. So your library holds your symbols of characters and stage props and things like that that you create, okay? So I'm just going to go through a few of these. Here's one. Okay, notice it's called Blink Light 2. These basically contain your drawings, the drawings that you're going to be using to put together your movie. Now, you have regular objects, and then you have objects that contain animation within them. And here you'll see there's this little play sign. That means that this has a nested, meaning embedded within it, an animation. So there's a separate timeline that we're going to take a look at in here that's causing animation to happen within this actual object. So we're going to go ahead and play this. And you'll notice slightly that there's a kind of a blinking effect happening here. I'll play it again. See that one more time. Okay. And basically that means that when I drag this particular character, these blinking lights, onto the stage, that animation is already going to be embedded. So when I drag it on here, it's going to have that animation happen, okay, as long as I put it onto the stage for a long enough time for that sequence to play out. Okay, all right, some of this may not be making sense now, and if you're confused, don't worry too much about it. We're going to go into all of this nested animations in more detail. I just want you to understand that the library basically contains all the parts that you're going to use, the characters, the background props, things like that, that you're going to use in your movie are contained in here so that you can eventually reference them, okay? People sometimes try to think of these as layers, but they're not layers. They're just, you got to think of this as your chest again that contains all of these objects. And some of these are just plain, they're stationary, nothing is happening, and then some of them you can play, okay? So this one here doesn't have a little play button, it's just this particular object, okay? All right, so this is your library, it's like your chest of stuff, all right? This properties palette contains the properties that are attributed to your chest of stuff, such as later on when you do like blur effects, but it also contains information about your stage. So here you'll notice that it says your stage size and then the frames per second. That's how many frames are in each second to make the sequence play. Okay, and we'll talk about more about that later as we start animating. All right. And then here you have all of your tools. You'll notice some of these look very familiar. They look like things that you've seen in other software. Okay. And then we'll take a look at here you have some other tools, okay? And some of these tools, if they're not up by default, you can always access them under Window, okay? And there's different toolbars and different panels that you can open up, okay? These are all the ones that are set. If you go into Essentials and you do Reset Essentials, it should line up your whole screen like this, okay, with all these different palettes. So that's what you want to do, is make sure that you have it set up like that, okay? If any of these panels get out of place, you just go in here and do Reset Essentials, and it'll put all of these palettes back where these are, okay? Now, that is in CS6, okay? In CC, the difference that you'll see, again, let me just switch to that screen. Okay, so in here what you're looking at is the interface for Flash CC. Notice the panel is darker, and here, instead of being essentials would look something like this. And the palettes aren't organized correctly. If you go into Classic, what Classic does is it basically makes the setup and the tools that are available to you look just like CS6, with the exception of the color, and then also that this timeline is up here. And that's a quick fix. You can just grab this timeline here, and if you want it to look exactly like the video tutorials so that you know where to access the timeline, you can just move it and position it into down here at the bottom, okay? Now, speaking of the timeline, that's what we're going to discuss next. All right. Now, the most important and probably most difficult concept to understand is going to be this timeline here, okay? This timeline, anything that appears in this timeline is either happening on this stage, or there's a timeline also for those individual objects that you created in here, like the one with the blinking lights, okay? That has its own separate timeline. Now, I'm just going to focus on this one right now. We'll talk more about these embedded timelines later on as we cover nested symbols, okay? But this basically here is anything that appears on this stage. Depending on when it appears on this stage, you'll notice that there's some highlighted blue areas, some highlighted gray areas, and then some blank areas in here. Depending on what is inside of the layers at a particular time in the timeline, it's what's going to appear on the stage, okay? So your layers in this program are actually inside a timeline. And basically, whereas in programs that are stationary, such as Photoshop or an Illustrator, everything is visible at the same exact time, and depending on what layer you have on, here it's actually on at the specific time you tell it to be on. So something can be on 1 minute and then off the next minute, meaning it's not visible at one point in time and then visible at another point in time, however you tell it to be, okay? To better illustrate that, I'm going to actually go ahead and turn on some of this animation, these layers here. Notice you can build layers in this timeline, and you can affect their visibility based on when they're seen here, okay? And that's what these highlighted areas show, all right? This is your timeline, okay? These are your layers within that timeline. To create new layers, you would go in here. To delete new layers in here. To create folders and compartments to organize these layers would be here, okay? Right now, there's just a series like layers for the different characters and things that are happening, okay? So this one says stage frame, a start button, an action, a twinkle, a dance, a fairy. Now you'll notice some of these are blank in here because they're not necessarily visible here, but they may be visible later on in the timeline, okay? All right, I'm going to go back to the beginning. So basically, when you see these numbers here, these are not seconds. These are frames per second. And you'll notice that when we went to our properties palette, there were 12 frames per second. That means that in 1 second, there is 12 frames, okay? That means that if I said how many frames are in 2 seconds, you would say 24 frames, okay? That means that from here to here, which is 12 frames, only 1 second, what we know as 1 second of real time, has elapsed. So from here to here, that's going to take 1 second, okay? So what you need to learn to do is, as you're considering your animation, as you're saying something is going to zoom in just like this zoomed in, okay? You're going to need to ask yourself, how long do I want that zoom to take? And if you say to yourself, I want that zoom to take 3 seconds, then you need to multiply that by 12 and come out with how many frames that is. That's 36 frames. Okay, who said art didn't have math in it? It doesn't in our case. You're going to need to multiply that, come up with that number, and then when you start setting, and we're going to learn more about how you do this, when we start setting your keyframe that tells something to grow, you know, to zoom in, you're going to need to set that time, okay? So here we're just going to look at this, okay? We'll notice at this point in time, there was a play button here, okay, that start button, this one here. Notice there's only a filled up space in this particular frame in time right here. That's the only place it's seen. Then here it's all blank. They kind of stagger. You'll notice there's white frames and there's the gray frame and then there's some white ones. These are just to count every 5 frames. These are the little notes, okay? But when something has something in it, such as this gray one, this is just a frame that we've put around it just to make sure that you know where your frame is at. And then this one here, this is this little area here, the fairy. Okay, when you see that it's filled in, it means that it's being visible at that time. So you'll notice from this point to this point, play is no longer in that second frame. It's not even a full second. It's just basically at the beginning. And once you click on it, it jumps to the next frame and it starts playing the animation. And only the things that are on here are visible. We can scroll down so you can get a better sense of how these are staggered. There's a lot of layers. See all of that? A lot of layers, and basically all of these layers are containing different parts from your library, these items that you have stored in here. Okay, now a couple of things that you want to keep in mind as we start animating forward, and I'm going to repeat this again in that lesson that deals with animation, is that if an object is going to be moving, okay, if an object is going to be moving, if it's going to have a motion animation in it, you can only put one of these symbols, okay, on that layer in order to make them move. Okay, let me repeat. You can only put one of these symbols on one of these layers, okay, if you want that particular object to actually move, to have some kind of a motion tween in it, okay? Whether that means growing in size, changing in color, or moving position. All right, you would need to create a layer for it to put it on its own layer. Okay, if the objects are stationary, like a bunch of objects that make up the background, like the trees, the ground, the sky, the sun, as long as they don't have any animation that happens on the stage, like growing, shrinking, rotating, changing colors, anything like that happens on the stage here, then you can put all of those objects, stationary objects, you can put multiple stationary objects on its own layer. Okay, so like a background might have multiple layers. All right, but if you wanted to have animation, you cannot, and that's why you end up with so many layers here. Okay, the blank areas mean that they're not visible. The gray areas mean, like this one here, means that they're visible, but they're stationary. The blue areas here mean that there's actually some kind of movement happening. These little dots here mean that at this particular point in time, you're telling it to do something else, okay? I'm going to go ahead and select this so you see it's this particular object here. Right now, if I because there's already a motion tween established here, I know that because it's blue. If I were to go here and I would grab this and move it, oh, it's actually this one here, it'll put this little icon right here, this little dot right here, okay? That's a keyframe. It's basically telling it to do something different there. Now, when it does it, see it's zooming, now it's zooming up like I told it to do. Okay? So basically, gray areas mean there's stationary objects on there. Blue areas mean that there's some kind of motion happening. These little dots that are here mean that something special is happening at that point in time that you've told it to do. And these are blank keyframes, meaning that you've set an area that's supposed to be blanked. And anywhere where they're blank like this, it means that nothing is in there, nothing is happening or visible at that time. Okay. Once you create a layer for a certain object like this fairy, you can decide to make that fairy appear here and then not appear for a really long time. And then you can, and then you can later on ask it to appear again. As long as you have keyframes that are blank in between, it won't be visible in this area. And then you can start adding visibility of it again here, like it's doing here. Okay. Now another thing you want to be familiar with is the scrubbing of timeline. I'm going to go ahead and just click, hold down, and drag. And you'll notice that here I am scrubbing the timeline. Okay. I can also similarly just hit return or enter on the keyboard, and it'll play out. Something to keep in mind is that it doesn't work in real time. It's somewhat close to real time, but it's not really real time. So you would actually have to publish this movie, which would be File, publish, preview, flash, and it would be publishing the movie and then playing it to get a real sense of the time. Okay, so every so often you'd want to do a publish, okay? All right, so these are your basics on what the interface looks like and what your basic panels are. We're going to go over more in detail on its own separate instructional videos, how to work with the drawing tools and some of these tools that we find here. Okay, we're going to learn more about the library palette and how to actually create these objects. Okay, so we're going to learn how to draw with these tools, how to turn things into symbols, or how to import them from your Illustrator project and convert them into symbols. Okay, and we're also going to learn about how to individually animate things, how to put things onto the stage, how to create blank frames so that an object isn't visible, how to create motion tweens so that you can move them. The fundamentals of Flash are pretty much the same. Once you learn how to do a motion tween, it's the same thing to change the color of an object. It's the same kind of thing to grow an object. You just change one variable in it, and it's basically telling it to grow instead of change colors, telling it to shrink instead or to rotate instead, all right? That's the only variable that changes. Putting in objects is fairly easy as well. You just don't tell it to move. You just drag it in at that particular point in time when you want it. The hard thing to remember and to kind of capture is this idea that at every given point in time, something different can be happening, and how to kind of not only work with layers this way, like in terms of what's on top of what, but also the timeline going this way and how things are changing and different things are being visible at the same time. Okay, that's usually one of the most difficult concepts to grasp, is just this idea of movement and time. Okay, the other really complex thing that you're going to encounter is this idea of not only animating on the stage, but also this idea of nested animation. Okay, and we'll talk more about nested animation and why that's important to understand also, and why we would need nested animation instead of just doing everything on the stage. Okay, but that's also going to be its own lesson. Okay, so the fundamentals of Flash are actually pretty basic. They look a little bit more complex, but the idea of just animation itself and working in time and space is what's really difficult to grasp. Okay, all right, so this concludes your lesson on the interface of Flash. If you have any questions, please hit me up or see me during office hours. Okay.